diplomacy necessarily is a series of negotiations and a series of agreements. And it's treated as this kind of, you only had one shot to do everything with Iran. It had to be in this deal. And that's just not at all how diplomacy works. And frankly, I think the Trump administration is going to learn that right now.
In contrary to the distortions that have been thrown out there about this agreement, it did not end in 15 years or 25 years. That whole process was laid out. And so literally, I can sit here today and say we had the greatest insight, visibility, transparency, accountability of any agreement I've ever seen since I've been in public life.
In the same way that the United States have been described, I think, as laboratories of democracy, Hungary had become almost a laboratory of autocracy in the Orban years.
Welcome back to The Long Game. I'm Jake Sullivan.
And I'm Jon Feiner. Today we're going to be focused yet again on the conflict in Iran, negotiations, blockade, possible return to war. We're going to come back at the end and talk a bit about a major election that took place in Hungary with serious international implications that led to the defeat of Viktor Orban, close friend of the current U.S. administration, who will now be heading out of office. But before that, and importantly, we have a special guest, and it feels a bit odd for Jake and me to introduce John Kerry to an audience that is focused on foreign affairs, because many of you, if not all of you, are probably more familiar with him and his career than you are with us. But in the spirit of Henry Kissinger, who once said something like, not everybody needs an introduction, but people tend to like them, we're going to go ahead and give it a shot. So Jake and I both worked with John Kerry across 2 U.S. administrations. I had the honor personally of serving as his chief of staff at the end of the Obama administration. He will hate this line, but it's still worth saying it. John Kerry has served our country in various capacities for at least 45 years during his career. And during that time, he's had an almost Forrest Gump-like connection to the most consequential issues the country has faced, from his decorated service in Vietnam to coming home from that war and protesting against it to try to get it to end, to landing on Richard Nixon's enemies list as a result of those protests, to serving for decades.
I thought you were going to say landing on the moon.
Not yet, but you know, these days
that could still come. Artemis 3.
You've got time. You've got some years to devote to that. Decades of service in the U.S. Senate, 2004 presidential nomination, and his tenure as President Obama's second-term Secretary of State, which included both the Iran nuclear deal, which we will obviously dig into during this episode, and also the Paris Climate Accord, which I know was both a passion project and a consequential one for the world, and then later serving in his last government role as Joe Biden's climate envoy. In addition to the Iranians, he has negotiated with Israelis and Palestinians to try to end their conflict, with Afghans to try to avert a civil war in that country, with Russians on the conflicts in Ukraine and Syria, and with Senate Republicans to try to get them to agree to put a price on carbon emissions. So he knows a thing or two about trying to solve hard problems with hard people. And he earned a reputation for extraordinary patience, relentlessness, and empathy for those across the table, which are underrated traits, we think, for a top diplomat. So John Kerry, welcome to The Long Game.
Thank you, guys. I'm really happy to be here with you.
So, Mr. Secretary, we are going to dig into negotiating with the Iranians, the current state of play with respect to the diplomacy between the Trump administration and Iran. But there's another actor here in the middle of all this, which is the Pakistanis. And John mentioned all the people you negotiated with. You also had the opportunity to negotiate with them on a mission that President Obama sent you on when you were still in the Senate to try to recover the remains of the stealth helicopter that went down as part of the bin Laden raid. And so you've been there in the room with those guys. It's kind of an unusual thing that the Pakistanis are sitting here as the peacemakers, given their historic role in the region. But could you talk for a minute about that experience and how you see their role in all of this as the U.S. and Iran try to come to some understanding?
Well, as you guys know better than most people, foreign policy is a combination of things, and it's largely representing your interests and understanding the interests of the people you're dealing with. And to the degree you can build a personal relationship, so much the better. So in Pakistan, we had a lot of problems, as you guys remember, with the ISI, their intelligence service, which played a lot of different angles and games, and you never quite could be certain you were getting a truth or the truth. But on the other hand, there were moments where they could be really helpful because of the relationships they had sort of under the table and on the side. And as we were wrestling with terrorists, the Pakistani Taliban, and they were constantly playing in Afghanistan, and that was really problematic. So you have to find, to be really careful to know you weren't being led down the primrose path and lied to or misled or, a decoy. But they also had an ability to be able to be helpful. And where things were practical, I found that we were able to get some things done, like getting the helicopter back and those kinds of things. I mean, I spent hours with General Kayani, who was then, God rest his soul, the powerhouse in the country. And really, the ISI was calling a lot of the shots. There was a certain disorder within the government, which made things very, very difficult. But in the end, you've got to go to the people in the places where you can leverage behavior. And that's exactly what they're doing now. I think it's for the better. I'm delighted that the Prime Minister has stepped in. I think, whenever Pakistan can find a moment to prove its, and this sounds a little condescending, I don't mean it that way, but to really show that the government's coming together and the government is prepared to actually work, because often it is not, and it's a disparate group of interests. So I hope this can work.
So let's get right to the nuclear talks. I think the first time the three of us were all in the same room together was probably in the early days of the negotiations around the JCPOA, either in Geneva or Vienna or one of those European capitals, probably Geneva, I guess, for the first round. You started working on Iran actually also before you became Secretary of State.
I was chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee.
And then you and President Obama made a sort of strategic decision that we had this problem with Iran's nuclear program. Too close to the potential of getting a weapon for comfort for the United States against our interests, and that the best way to deal with that was through a diplomatic deal. Not a deal that would be negotiated over one day or even 1 week or even 1 month, but over multiple years. Can you just describe that project, what the Iranians were like as negotiating partners, and when you started, did you realize you were going to be launching on this extended saga that would take up probably more of your time than anything else as Secretary of State?
No, I didn't know how long it would take. But Jake played a key role in the very beginning there when I remember going to President Obama as chairman of the committee, and I said, look, I've won a friendship with the Sultan of Oman, who was actually quite sick at the time. He had cancer, but we became really friendly. I mean, we just struck up a terrific relationship. In fact, later on in his cancer, right before he died, I was the only diplomat in the world who went to Bad-Gastein and met with him and talked about the track we were on, and he helped. I was able to persuade him, actually, because the Ayatollah, the word we were getting from the Omanis was, they don't trust you. They're not going to talk to you. They're the Iranians. And the Ayatollah particularly, has a bee in his bonnet about it. And of course, the IRGC would keep pushing, you can't negotiate with the great Satan. There's no way they will deliver. You can't trust them, et cetera. And so I had this intermediary who was sort of working the file in Oman. And I persuaded the Sultan to take a trip to Iran to meet with the Ayatollah in order to kind of convey to him his sense that our bona fides were good, that we were prepared to be honest, we were prepared to be fair brokers, we were prepared to try to get a fair deal. And that played a role in his giving permission to these talks to even take place, because frankly, they were bitter enough about the U.S., antipathy to them, that it was really hard. There was no clarity of the fact that the Ayatollah was going to let anybody really negotiate. In the end, he became a force for closing the deal. He and now killed. Now he died, and then you had the subsequent Ayatollah come in. But they were supportive of this idea. The people who wanted the nuclear weapon, and there were people in Iran who wanted a nuclear weapon. Israel was not incorrect to say, okay, we need to be wary of what's happening. But it primarily came from the IRGC. And they opposed.
Who are now closer to power maybe than
they were before. And they opposed having any talks or going into any limitations on the nuclear program. So actually there were some sort of, I don't know if it's fair to call them moderates, but there were people who had a different opinion in Iran who wanted to move to negotiate with the West to actually bring people together and see if they could open themselves up to the world. And this was the great benefit of what we were trying to do. We didn't just want to have a short deal, do this, put this in the package, put the nuclear weapon into the refrigerator, so to speak, and let it sit. We wanted to go further and had a theory of the case about regime change that ultimately would come as they were exposed to the world and taken, down a different path and could see the benefits of it, and their people could see the benefits of it. So there's been no theory of the case, so to speak, like that. In this instance, Israel, the Prime Minister came over here, sat in the Situation Room, and said to the President of the United States and the assembled folks there, there are 4 things that can happen. You can, bomb them and we can end their nuclear capacity and the people will rise up and there'll be a change of regime, et cetera. But Israeli intelligence folks will now tell you they had no plan. They had worked the process. So, John, going back to sort of how we began, we had to build serious blocks here. And I remember going to Hillary, to Secretary Clinton, with Jake in the room. And we met, and I talked about this intermediary and about what was being proffered, whether or not we could try to advance this. And in the end, Jake went over with Bill Burns, I think it was, and they sort of sketched out an outline to what might or might not be able to be done. And we built off that. I mean, it became sort of, there were huge hurdles, as you remember, in between, and tough negotiations. I mean, one thing I found is really tough negotiators and slow negotiators dragging it out and finding things. I mean, I can tell you a funny story. It's half funny. Towards the end of the negotiations, we were in Vienna after 3 weeks of steady negotiating.
19 days. I think the longest an American Secretary of State had ever been out of the country in one place, maybe in American history, but certainly in a long time.
And negotiating every single day. Ironically, about 1 block away from a house of ill repute on the street, if you remember.
I don't remember.
John, do you remember that?
I remember that very well. Yeah, thank you for pointing that out.
Well, there were great contradictions on a daily basis, and that was one of them.
Some people thought the diplomacy was a house of ill repute.
Were you guys going stir crazy? I mean, 19 straight days?
19 straight days. We celebrated the 4th of July. The hotel put on a big 4th of July thing. It was great. But here's the point I want to make is that we thought they were sort of stalling and not pushing. Yep. And Lavrov was growing impatient.
The Russian foreign minister. Still the Russian foreign minister,
Sergei Lavrov, who is a very experienced and very smart and very capable diplomat. We obviously have disagreements with the positions he has represented, but he knows how to argue for his country, and he's a smart cookie. So he came to me and said, we're going to be leaving here. We're going to get out of here pretty soon and so forth. So we kind of had a showdown in the hotel room where I brought in Mogherini and I brought in Lavrov. And
Mogherini was the
European diplomat who was working as
part mediator, part negotiator.
Yeah. And of course we had Sergei Lavrov and Zarif, Javad Zarif, the Iranian Prime Minister of Iran. And there were some hot words exchanged, really hot. And at one point, Minister Zarif got up and started to walk out screaming at Lavrov, and I had to literally get up and stand between the two of them, or it was going to come to, fisticuffs. But that confrontation and the presence of Lavrov and sort of the pressure of this moment saying, look, are we going to do this or aren't we going to do this?
And Lavrov, the Russian, almost pressuring Zarif to do
now's
the deal,
the time to make this. And in that golden moment, literally, it came together and we shook hands. The deal, the deal's going to be done.
So 1 minute, it's almost a fist fight. The next minute,
next moment,
shaking hands,
we were actually,
Iran nuclear deal.
They had the Iran nuclear agreement done.
Yeah.
And what's important from all of that, I think, Jake, is that, Russia was in the room. Wang Yi, the foreign minister of China, was not in the room at that moment, but he was involved directly in helping to move things. I flew to China a couple of times, you'll recall, met with President Xi, solicited his help, particularly on dealing with the nuclear materials. How are we going to do? How do we have confidence they're going to be, so these folks all joined in this. What I think is critical to this moment, historically, is that China, Russia, Germany, France, UK, United States, UN, were all at the table, all signing off on an agreement that absolutely, for certain, took a nuclear weapon off the table, at least for a year. Our goal was we've got to have a year before breakout time. And we achieved that. We actually were above 1 year. And so that agreement was entirely enforceable. It came with the greatest level of scrutiny, the greatest level of penetration of on-site inspections, of human redundancy in that process, of any nuclear agreement we've ever done. It literally is the strongest nuclear agreement the United States or the world has ever seen, because all of our intelligence community, the Russian, the Chinese, the European, our own, told us this deal will allow us to know what they're doing. And indeed, we did. And when President Trump decided to pull out, even Israeli intelligence was saying to him, don't pull out. They are in compliance. So this is a war we're now in that absolutely never had to be fought, did not have to be fought. And it's questionable now, will we even get back to where we were? Or are we in a situation where we had a war, where the deal was broken, and we won't have necessarily the kind of insight that we had through that deal? It's a shocking, it's really a stunning reversal of common sense, of stubbornness, of ideology, or just shooting from the hip.
Well, after all that shooting from the hip, and after all that literal shooting and bombing, the Trump administration seems to have come around to the view that, hey, we actually got to do some diplomacy with these guys. And we had one round, 21 hours apparently in the room. Doesn't quite match the 19-day stretch that you guys did right at the end. Now J.D. Vance, it looks like, along with Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner and others, may end up in another round of diplomacy. If J.D. Vance called you up, not that he's likely to, but call any of us up, but if he did and said, hey, what did you learn? What advice would you give me for how to deal with these guys? One of whom, Abbas Araghchi, the current foreign minister, was in that room with you for all that time.
And we got to know him very well.
So if he said to you, Mr. Secretary, what advice would you give us? What did you learn from this? What would you tell us now to do to try to get out of this jam, this pickle that we're in, to actually get to something useful? What would you say?
Well, the first thing I would say is you've really got to know who you're talking to, and you've got to have respect. It's a word you always hear in dealing with the Chinese, mutual respect. You need to have a level of humility and respect for their own history, which in their case is several thousand years. Ours is 250 years. And they're very proud of that. I found Iranians there to be as proud of nation. So I saw a pride of nation state and of history, and you can't just run by that. You can't
so saying things like you must agree to our terms, or unconditional surrender.
Just walk in and say,
or
hey,
a civilization will die tonight, for example.
Not a good. Also, it's a little bit difficult to sit there and be ordering people or putting mandates in front of them when you've just killed the Ayatollah, you've killed the wife, you've killed the daughter, you've killed the brother. I mean, and then I think, and we saw this flare up of pride on occasion. I mean, I remember once, we were having a real hard, tough argument about making sure that we were able to see what they were doing. And we had to make that fail-safe. Reagan said, trust but verify. We, with President Obama, said, don't trust but verify. And we built the strongest verification capacity you could conceivably build. So we have redundancy of people, of process. We had radio seals on the centrifuges. We had them destroy the vast majority of their centrifuges, keeping only the oldest ones. We had television cameras in the facilities where they would manufacture. And contrary to the distortions that have been thrown out there about this agreement, it did not end in 15 years or 25 years. There were certain items which changed, but the fundamental capacity to be able to have a demand inspection and enforce that demand inspection and go back to all of the sanctions and have the ability to be able to leverage a challenge inspection, that whole process was laid out. And so literally, I can sit here today and say we had the greatest insight, visibility, transparency, accountability of any agreement that I've ever seen since I've been in public life. And unfortunately, in just pulling out, we reinforced the worst fears of the Ayatollah, who said you can't trust the great Satan. And indeed, they don't trust. They didn't trust us. So I think that if Jared and Steve and company, the vice president, go in there and really work at making sure the Iranians understand that you understand some of their own difficulties and challenges here. And I believe I personally believe we will get an agreement. I think there's going to be an agreement forthcoming of one kind or another. I think the world needs that. I think we desperately need to calm things down. We need to, the commonality of interests in that region, the Middle East, are just staggering. There's so much that we could be working towards with all of those countries. It came close. You came close. You were working hard to get Saudi Arabia on board. I am convinced, I don't have the intel to show it, but I'm convinced that one of the reasons October 7th happened, which is so egregious and did traumatize Israel, all of us need to recognize how horrible that day of racism, of sheer fury and misogynistic and all the horrible things that were done that day, that would change any country. And so Israel is now a different nation than it was before that. But you, by the work that was being done to give life to the Abraham Accords and have Saudi Arabia join and then ultimately recognize Israel, that Hamas suddenly said, oh my God, we better take center stage here. And so it underscores the great complication of that region and how difficult it is. But our Iran nuclear agreement spoke to all of those challenges, and it provided a roadmap for how you could ultimately try to have a peaceful outcome. Now, if Iran did what we all suspected it might do, which is why we made it so tough in terms of visibility, if Iran decided, oh, okay, we're going to cheat, we're going to go after this, we had 1 year during which we could put to them, hey, guys, we know what you're doing, and if you don't stop it, there are going to be serious implications. Then you would act with Russia and China and everybody else who had an interest in the viability of this agreement.
You've laid out, I think, a very strong case for the deal, one that we believe and share, but there are also a number of criticisms of the Iran nuclear deal. So I just want to put those on the table and get your reaction to them. So people say a number of things, that it failed to constrain Iran's bad behavior beyond the nuclear program, the proxies.
Great.
And
I'm
the
glad
missiles.
you asked that.
Second, that it expired at some point,
right.
10 to 15 years after it was implemented. Third, that it allowed Iran to enrich uranium at all. And fourth, to your point about the world being represented in the room, there were some parties, I think, who believed they should be represented in the room and were not. The countries in the region, the Gulf countries primarily, I think, believed they were left out. What do you make of those criticisms? And the argument, by the way, that the critics make, which now feels a bit hollow, that, they didn't want war. They just wanted a better deal.
Let me answer all that. And if I leave anything out, come back and prod me. This agreement had a 15-year or a 25-year, for instance, the television cameras were going to, be watching every ounce of uranium that was mined and milled and put into yellow cake and then ultimately controlled as waste, was accounted for, every ounce. So, yes, there were a couple of things where we knew it didn't make a difference in our ability to 100% track what was happening. We did give them a 15-year cutoff of one thing or another, but remember, the enrichment process limited them to enrichment of 3.67% of enrichment.
Stockpile they have now is up to 60%.
Stockpile now is allegedly, the buried stockpile now is about 440 kilograms.
Of 60%.
60%. Right.
And they had several thousands when we were beginning. We took that away. We left them with 1 or 2% of what they had, and that was highly accountable. But here's what's important. Iran is a signatory. Unlike some other nations that possess nuclear weapons, Iran is a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And that treaty has an additional protocol that was added to it, partly because of what happened in North Korea and partly because people felt we needed greater insight. So that has challenge capacity. You can say, we want to inspect this building. We believe something's happening there. And if Iran doesn't give you access to that within a very short period of time, boom, sanctions come back, and you can decide, okay, we have to use self-help here. We're going to have to bomb, or we may have to enforce. Zero expiration on their membership in the NPT, which they could decide to get out of, in which case we would have probably gone to war. But absent that, they had to live up to that agreement. And we had the capacity to enforce, and that was for lifetime. There was no cutoff of their responsibility to live up to the additional protocol, to live up to the restraint on amount of enrichment, and so forth. Now, on the other issues, I mean, it's almost insulting to us to suggest that, we weren't taking note of what was happening with Hezbollah, or what's happening with the Houthi, or what's happening in, with missiles that they're bringing in and building and pointing at Tel Aviv. We all understood, obviously, deeply, the threat to Israel. And I don't think there was a better friend than President Obama during that period of time when he put serious money on the table. I think it was about $38 billion. A memorandum was signed. We put everything on the table to make sure people understood we supported Israel and they weren't going to be threatened. So the question was, how do you get where you want to go? I.e., take the nuclear weapon off the table, and also address the missiles and Hezbollah and support for the Houthis and the envelopment, so to speak, this crescent, as it was referred to by many of our Arab friends. There was a, quote, Shia crescent growing around Sunni world, and that threatened people. So we made it clear, yes, we have to negotiate those issues. But first, we need, because they're about 2 weeks away from breakout capacity, we've got to put the lid on the coffin of their capacity to have a nuclear weapon, and then we will go to each of these other areas, missiles, et cetera. That could not have been more clear. And obviously, the plan with the administration, and Jake, you're more than familiar with this, obviously, was to rely on President Clinton, Hillary, to immediately move to take those next steps. That was the plan. And needless to say, the vote was different and there was a different outcome, and that never happened.
So I remember well you telling us at the time, as all of this was being debated in the Congress and the Israelis were coming over and making their case, Netanyahu speaking before, that one thing people don't understand about the Iran nuclear deal is the Iran nuclear deal was not meant to be the end. It was meant to be the beginning. And that diplomacy necessarily is a series of negotiations and a series of agreements. And indeed, the Iran nuclear deal could have had follow-on elements just on the nuclear program itself, extending various things or whatever. And then these other issues could get negotiated as well. And it's treated as this kind of, you only had one shot to do everything with Iran. It had to be in this deal. And that's just not at all how diplomacy works. And frankly, I think the Trump administration is going to learn that right now, because I agree with you. They're likely to get to some form of deal, but that deal is going to be the start of more negotiations with the Iranians that'll come down the road.
I mean, look, I was negotiating with them for at least 4 years plus.
Exactly.
And there's no way you're going to resolve all these other issues without that. And needless to say, we have to include our friends. I mean, UAE, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, these folks have to all be at the table helping us to shape this longer term future. And they have obviously a huge stake, needless to say. And we owe it to the entire region to do this in a way that's going to be successful, not in a haphazard kind of starting a war where you're asking people to rise up against the regime, who've already seen whatever numbers of thousands of people killed because they were demonstrating. And all of a sudden you say, oh my gosh, they didn't rise up. What happened here? Well, there's Israeli intelligence that's now becoming public, which articulates that the Israelis didn't do anything in their part, and we certainly didn't do anything to build the capacity to know who might be the leader, how that process might unfold. You don't just, you don't start a war sitting there saying, well, we hope they rise up. And that literally is the way this is played out. Apparently you do. Yeah.
So can we ask you about two of your former workplaces and their role in this conflict? One is the U.S. Congress. You famously testified in the U.S. Senate, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, toward the end of the Vietnam War. You asked this famous question: How do you ask
a man to be the last man to die for a mistake?
Trying to get the Senate to act to constrain the U.S. administration at that time. The U.S. Congress has not played much of a role in constraining the Trump administration, even though there are many members, it seems, who are uncomfortable with the fact that the United States has gone to war without asking for congressional authorization. Even Republicans, I think, privately have some of these concerns. President Trump obviously ran under a very different theory of American power, saying we would not go back to these misadventures in the Middle East. What would your advice be to your former colleagues in that body about what they should be doing in this moment when it feels like they are not doing all that much?
Well, I think, it's very difficult when you don't have either house. When you have the White House and both the House of Representatives and the Senate in the hands of one party, traditionally the Senate has always, pulled back a little bit when that's the situation. I know some of my former colleagues there, good friends, are deeply, deeply frustrated. But truly, it's just a matter of fact that the members of the party in the majority have been unwilling to hold the president accountable. And I find that, and I think it's really, really sad, truly sad. I love the institution. If you get to go to the United States Senate, allegedly the world's greatest deliberative body, and you're able to debate the great issues of your time, it's a pinch me moment in life. And sadly, it's not living up to it today. So I think that, Harry Truman, quick story, Harry Truman, a young senator sitting in the back, way over in the corner where you sit when you're 99 or 100 or whatever, which is where I sat when I first got there in seniority. And he wrote a letter home to his mother frequently. He was always writing his mother, and he wrote, "Dearest mother, I'm here in the Senate, looking across. It's late at night. We're debating the great issues of our time. I see the ghosts of Webster and Clay, and and I pinch myself and I say, God, how the hell did I get here?" And about 3 months later, he's working his, another debate, and he's there late at night. He says, "Mother, I'm here again. It's late at night." I look across the aisle and see my colleagues. I pinch myself and I say, how the hell did they get here? Anyway. So look, it's politics, and you have to, find a way to break through.
Your other workplace, the State Department, you were Secretary of State. I don't know if you felt while you were Secretary of State, hey, I got plenty of time to also be National Security Advisor. That's what Marco Rubio has chosen to do.
Well, you can answer this question.
I can certainly say from my side, no, but I could see from your perspective as Secretary of State, hey, it'd be kind of good if there wasn't any National Security Advisor there.
Not to have one at all.
The Kissinger model.
Yeah, exactly. What do you make of all that? And also, he's taken two jobs, right? National Security Advisor and Secretary of State. But if you go down the big ticket negotiations, Russia, Ukraine, Iran, Gaza, you look around the world now, a number of others as well. You were at the heart of all of that as Secretary of State. For whatever reason, Secretary Rubio, even when J.D. Vance is over there negotiating this, he's at a UFC fight in Miami. How do you look at the State Department right now, that role, the way that this administration conducts diplomacy?
Well, I don't think there's, I think a lot of it is ad hoc. I don't think there's no piece of paper that says, here's the responsibility designation for this person over here. It's sort of a grab bag. And I can't speak to that because I don't know who's deciding what or what's in somebody's mind. I've been surprised that the Secretary hasn't been more front and center in some of this negotiating. It's not done by one meeting. You guys know that. I mean, it takes a building process. It takes a lot of personal diplomacy, back and forth, shuttle, as you did. And John, you've done it. You're familiar with that. And I don't see that. I don't see the relationship building going. Maybe it is behind the scenes. I still believe they'll get to an agreement for the simple reason that both parties need one.
We want to ask you about a couple of the other actors in this conflict, and maybe first on someone you've mentioned and a country you've mentioned, Prime Minister Netanyahu and Israel. There's been obviously a lot of reporting about the Israeli role there. This is a joint venture, after all, between the United States and Israel. This war, they're fighting alongside each other, but also in their role in generating this conflict in the first place. You probably spent as many hours with Prime Minister Netanyahu as any American official. I was there with you for a lot of that. During the war, Israel has also expanded its invasion and occupation of southern Lebanon, going after Hezbollah. Violence in the West Bank by settlers has increased substantially. You gave a speech at the end of your time as Secretary of State, foreshadowing, warning about some of this to come, and basically signaling, now this was 10 years ago, that the two-state solution was in jeopardy. So talk a little bit about both the Israeli role in this conflict, but also this issue that's been close to your work for many years, the effort to make peace between Israelis and Palestinians, which seems more fraught than maybe it's ever been.
Well, I think it is. I think it's on life support, if even. I would not have spent that kind of time, John. I mean, I'm not a blind, wishful kind of operator who's going to go out and just, be hopeful about outcomes. The Prime Minister was very clear to me about his desire to try to find a solution and to work seriously to do it. And for a period of time, we pursued that, I think, diligently with John Allen, General John Allen, who had been our, commander of forces in Afghanistan for a period of time, very capable. We put together a team of about 150 people from the DIA, from the CIA, from the Homeland Security, from the FBI, and every intelligence entity to measure with precision how can we put a plan on the table that's really going to do the job of providing for Israel's security, which we made number one. If you don't, and Netanyahu was very clear, I want security. I want Israel. And we said, so do we. And we're going to give that to you. So security was front and center in this. So I got King Abdullah to agree to have 2 roads on either side of the Jordan River with 2 fences with 24/7 patrols so that not an ant or a scorpion could cross that without you seeing it. 2 Aegis balloons up in the air, tethered balloons with which can track 350 targets simultaneously. Airport built that had a sliver of its airport in Palestine, but also in Jordan, managed by Israel, with Israelis present in that facility to make sure every egress and egress was covered. I mean, all the imaginative things we could do to create it. And we had a secret meeting in Aqaba at which President al-Sisi came, King Abdullah came, I was there representing the U.S., John Allen was there, and we had maps that showed what was happening to the West Bank, that if you were going to have a two-state solution, which was still the announced policy of all of Europe, the United States, and allegedly Prime Minister Netanyahu in Israel saying, yes, we support two-state, a famous speech he gave at Balal University.
My vision of peace in this small land of ours, two free peoples live side by side in amity and mutual respect. Each will have its own flag, its own national anthem, and its own government. Neither will threaten the security or survival of the other.
And so we worked on the presumption that we had partners on both sides, Palestinian and otherwise, who were ready to act, recognizing that increasing amounts of the West Bank were disappearing to the settlements. And a U.S. policy under every president, Republican, Democrat, has always been we're against the settlements. But in the Oslo Accords of 1993, there were about 100,000 settlers. Now there are over 700,000, and they're pouring in now, being encouraged to go in by Minister Ben-Gvir, and they're being armed, and there's a lot of violence taking place at what is happening now. And if you look at a map of what has happened to Israel in the West Bank, the greater Judea-Samaria argument is driving the choices that are being made. And it turns out that the prime minister is not supportive of two states. He is, in fact, 100%, and has said so publicly and reiterated it recently, that there will never be a Palestinian state while he is prime minister. And he has lauded the statesmanship of Israel and putting them where they are today. And so there was a big article, I think, yesterday, the day before in the New York Times, talking about sort of the one state solution that is unfolding, which is not really.
Which, by the way, you said in 2016, an irreversible one-state reality is taking hold in your speech.
And it's even more so taking hold now. And that's something that the current cabinet, every member of whom in the current cabinet has said there will not be a Palestinian state. So the world is now having to figure out, what are you going to do? You have 2 million Palestinians who've been moved from the northern part of Gaza into the south. So we had before the most concentrated gathering of human beings on the planet were in Gaza before the war. Now, 2 million more people have been pushed into the south and the north up for grabs. But I suspect that the Palestinians are not going to, be in charge there forever. And that's where we're developing. So the longer term prospect for how you're going to manage this area, which has been torn apart by this issue, is very real. And I tried to elicit from Foreign Minister Javad Zarif whether or not there was space for us to negotiate about Israel. Where could we go with that? And he said, no, right now, nothing's going to happen there. And I think positions are very hardened, and it's going to be a very difficult issue.
Do you think there's any chance that if there were a different government in Israel following the next election, which has to take place before the end of this year, that space could open up? Or do you think that this change you described in Israel since October 7th runs across the political spectrum so that a Palestinian...
Very, very important question, Jake. And I'll be candid with you, and I don't know what kind of response I'll get for doing so, but I think it's important to be candid about this. I think that October 7th, the level of racist, misogynistic, as I mentioned earlier, response of Hamas changed Israel, and I don't think there is a movement in Israel right now. I think Prime Minister Netanyahu knows his politics well. There's a reason that what's happening is unfolding, because I think that the body politic of Israel suffered a massive traumatic blow in that moment. And there's not a lot of space right now in people's minds for saying, okay, let's just set up a state next door where these guys could, somehow do that again, or something else could develop. Now, that ignores the fact that it would be allegedly demilitarized, no weapons, massive joint participation between Shin Bet, IDF, Palestinian security forces, U.S., Europe, others. I mean, there are all kinds of ways in which you can structure this. I think you now have to talk in a different time horizon. I think that you could have aspirations for a state, but it's going to have to meet real benchmarks as you move towards it. And there has to be some kind of guarantee about the capacity to preserve sort of a contiguous body of land. Now, we approached that with a massive land swap, which actually got 95% of all of the settlers into Israel with the swap. And so that obviates the need for a prime minister to do what Sharon did, which cost him, was a painful process of pulling out and just leaving it after all the battles and, the way, the difficulties people saw. So I think you have to address those longer term issues. And it may take, you've got to now, first of all, you got to rebuild a Palestinian Authority. You literally do not have that oft repeated phrase, we need a partner. You don't have a partner today. And so we've got to be realistic about how we define that roadmap. And I don't think this is the moment that you're going to be able to give it any oxygen at all. It's going to take time.
So for the U.S. Israel relationship, I mean, we talked before we got on, 40 Senate Democrats voted just yesterday. We're recording on today, Thursday, to withhold weapons shipments to Israel. If the reality that you're describing is taking hold, but no near term, let's say, no medium term, even prospects of a two-state solution, what does that mean for the U.S. Israel relationship going forward?
Well, the U.S. Israel relationship, I don't know if everybody's tuned into it, but it has also changed with October 7th and with the response thereto. Young people in the United States are overwhelmingly now concerned about Palestinian issue and really angry about some of the things that have played out in the context of how this war was prosecuted. And you're seeing that manifested in many different places now globally, I think. It's a problem for everybody in their foreign policy. They're going to have to really think through, how do you manage this? But young people and certainly certain segments of the U.S. are just not happy with what we have been supporting. And that 40 person vote in the United States Senate is reflective of that. Do you mind if I raise an issue that I just want to put on the table? Because it's going to be a huge part of the bigger challenge that we face globally going forward. The narrative has to change on climate. And I'm sorry to, some people don't want to hear about it. Some people sort of pushed it aside. But we are going to suffer massive implications in foreign policy, in global relationships, in the economies, by what is happening now on a global basis. The damages that are occurring in countries, the level of challenge to bring electricity to places that don't have it but need it. There's a huge economic change that's taking place. The Wall Street Journal had an article about 2 months ago. The headline was, "The energy transition is now unstoppable." And they laid out why it is going to happen as momentum of its own. At the World Economic Forum this year, there was an article by Bloomberg in which they said, you know who believes in climate change? Big letters, the stock market. And what's happened is $2.1 trillion has moved into investment in renewables, alternatives, energy, and $1 trillion into fossil fuels. First time ever that there's been that flip in the levels of where it's allocated.
Is there a possible silver lining in this war?
Yeah, that's what I'm about to, I'm absolutely clear that the great energy crisis of 1973 and then 1979 and China making its own decision in 2019 that, France went to nuclear, Japan went to alternative sources of energy than relying on, oil and gas. And the result is that today they're moving even faster. There's no way a country could look at the world today and say, whoa, the reminder, we got to be energy independent. And the truth is, we're really getting closer and closer to being able to do that. In UAE now, they're building 19 gigawatts of storage that goes with the 4 nuclear reactors they brought online and one of the largest solar fields in the world. So you have the UAE, a oil and gas producing country, wants to be one of the first in the world to be able to show we can do 24/7 firm energy. And that's a monumental step. We're close on fusion. We're seeing batteries become much, much more productive. Texas has become the largest deployer of wind in the United States and of solar. And they're using it to balance their grid. They have a grid of their own in Texas, no surprise. And they are able to deliver cheaper electricity and more stable delivery. And I think you're seeing, everywhere now there's a rush on nuclear, on small reactors and other things. This is going to change faster than most CEOs and most people in the country, in the world, are actually focused on.
It's interesting. There's a real irony that the politics of climate have gotten more challenging in a lot of places. And yet, as you say,
in this place.
In this place, but in Europe too, and elsewhere because of affordability issues and so forth, and a lot of the dislocations coming out of the Russia-Ukraine war. But the economics and technology of climate, you're telling a pretty optimistic story.
Let me tell you, we really are. We have a public equities track, and frankly, we killed all the indexes. We're doing tremendously in terms of returns there. We also are invested. We have a growth track. We've invested in a company by the name of Fervo. Fervo is geothermal. They had a pilot project in Nevada. They're now building a prototype in Utah, and they're going to be delivering to data centers energy within a short span of time. They're really moving fast and effectively. They've got new technology. 85% of the workers come out of the oil and gas drilling because they know how to drill, they know geology. And I saw that the Trump administration just put $174 million on the table for geothermal. So
it's interesting to me which renewables they like and don't like. Wind is a no-go, geothermal's okay.
It is fascinating.
It's all aesthetic or something.
Who don't knows? Like windmills.
Yeah, right.
Sure.
Exactly.
We'll let you get out of here
with
one last question.
Yes, sir.
Which is, this administration is going to end in January of 2029. Let's just stipulate that. Safe to say the world will have changed even more than it already has by then. What are you most worried about over the next few years? And then maybe to leave it on a high note, you're one of the most optimistic people I've ever been around. What gives you cause for hope at a challenging time?
Well, everything is a challenge now because there's a battle globally between democracy and illiberal democracy and authoritarianism. And if you don't step up and define more clearly the benefits and begin to deliver more effectively, you're playing into hands of the authoritarians. I think we're almost our own worst friend, so to speak. We're just not getting the job done. We can't even pass a budget in the United States. We have to put the future on the table again. We're not doing some of the great building projects we used to do. You look at Robert Moses. I mean, not all of it was great, but it did things. It kept America moving. So you ask me, why am I an optimist? I'm a huge optimist. I think there will be casualties along the way, but we ultimately will move on things. And I can find 100 different things where good people are working diligently to make good things happen. And generally speaking, America, that's who we are. You go back to de Tocqueville when he visited the U.S. and he wrote, Americans are doing well and are great because Americans are good people. They do charity. They take care of each other. There's a sort of, historic linkage of people in their communities to the pioneers and how everybody took care of them, looking out for one another. So generally we've done that, number one. Number two, our allocation of capital is, you can argue about it. There's robber baron capitalism. There's enlightened capitalism. And I obviously, and you all, want to support enlightened capitalism. The allocation of capital, generally speaking, in our country is better than anywhere else in the world. And we have the ability for, someone who didn't even graduate from college to go out with a great idea, to get people to back it, to build some of the biggest companies in the world out of that, and to help people lead a better life. We have big choices coming at us. The AI is going to have a massive impact on the way we do business, the way life is, played out, what's available to people, and it's going to have jobs impact somewhat in the next 2 years, big time after that sort of 2-year demarcation. So I worry, I am concerned, but I'm concerned for the disruption. I'm concerned for the harm that can be done during a transition when you don't do it properly, but I'm not concerned as to whether or not that transition is going to take place. This is so simple, to be honest with you. Some issues you need a rocket scientist to come in, he's got to work out the algorithm and you can get around the moon and do so forth. This is not that kind of issue, the challenge of our energy transition. This is about how we choose to provide energy or move vehicles. We burn fossil fuel, but don't capture the emissions. I'm not somebody who sits here and says, get rid of, they got to go away. No. If Vicky Holub at Occidental can find a way to have direct air carbon capture and make money and do good things with it, wow, great company, invest in it. But we can't ignore those kinds of choices and needs to sort of kick the economy into high gear around this transition. And a lot of it, I'm now encouraged, is just happening naturally because you can make money. And that's why I'm actually working in a private sector firm that's a fund, and we're trying to prove to people we're only focused on things that will accelerate the transition, and it's working. I think we can show people that you can do this and do well at the same time, do good and do well at the same time. So that's what gives me confidence. I think we're living longer than we ever lived before. We're cured diseases we never thought we'd cure. Life is better in so many different ways for people. People live longer than ever before. Why would you not be, feeling good about those kinds of things? And I think we've just got to calm down and do the business of our country, recognizing we have great options, better than any other people on the planet. We're very lucky.
Well said. Thank you. That's a great place to finish.
Wide-ranging conversation. Thanks for being with us. And,
good fun. Thank you,
good
guys.
to be back
I wish
together.
you well with this podcast thing.
Thanks so much.
We miss working with you.
Well, there's future.
All right.
Anyway.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. First, this is the first time we've actually had a set change during our podcast since we had the chance to speak.
Also,
with
haven't
Secretary
recorded
Kerry
in the same place for quite some time.
It's nice to see you.
Yeah, likewise. New location, but good to be together.
Exactly. The camera puts on pounds.
Yeah, well, that's for sure.
You're looking very svelte.
Yeah.
Actually, Secretary Kerry gave us, I think, a very good transition in his answer to the last question, where he talked about democracy versus illiberal democracy versus authoritarianism, because last week in Hungary, we had an incredible outcome of an election where Viktor Orban, the longtime quasi-authoritarian populist right-wing leader of Hungary, pro-Putin leader of Hungary, was defeated by a young newcomer to the national political scene in Hungary and a new movement that he built. And he was resoundingly defeated, where this new party won more than 2/3 of the seats in the Hungarian parliament. And there genuinely is the winds of change blowing in Budapest in a big way. And it has farther reaching implications as well. So just to set the stage, Viktor Orban has been around, was an ardent anti-communist, a real liberal, became a kind of hardcore right-winger, almost MAGA before MAGA style politician, began to lock down all of the different elements of government, media, the courts in Hungary, tilted the playing field in his favor. And it took a kind of combination of pretty magical things to come together to finally oust him. How this started, the guy who beat him, Peter Magyar, 45-year-old, was an official in his government.
Kind of a mid-level
mid-level official in his government, who ended up resigning after a scandal where Orban's party actually asked the president of Hungary, and the president of Hungary is essentially a ceremonial position. Orban is the prime minister with all the power, to pardon a Hungarian official who had covered up a sex abuse scandal at a boys' home in Hungary, a really tragic, terrible story. And this came out, this emerged, that person was pardoned, and then it came out that they had been pardoned despite their complicit role in this god-awful sex abuse scandal. And that led Peter Magyar to resign and go on television and start challenging the corruption and the venality of the Orban regime and directly challenge Orban himself. And that set him on a course to build in very short order over a couple of years this political movement that now has swept into power. And I think it's worth us talking about the implications of this for far-right parties, the implications of this for the United States of America, because of course the U.S. played some role in this, which we'll get to, the implications for Ukraine, because this is a really significant moment well beyond the borders of Hungary. So how do you see it?
And there's just a lot of parallels without, overdrawing comparisons between one country and another, because Hungary is its own case, its own fact pattern, but right down to the sort of damage that was done by a child sex abuse scandal, which we are reckoning with a different version of in the United States right now, has done some damage to the Trump administration with the Epstein scandal. But to take a step back, what's interesting to me about this election is the deck was completely stacked against Magyar. He was not allowed to go on TV after a certain period of time. He was barely allowed to campaign in major cities. So he took his campaign kind of out to the hinterlands and out to the countryside. And in the same way that the United States, or really the states in the United States, have been described, I think it was like an old Supreme Court phrase, Louis Brandeis or something, as laboratories of democracy, Hungary had become almost a laboratory of autocracy in the Orban years. They had tried out all of these techniques that are now being used by autocrats elsewhere. I hate to say it, including here, going after universities, going after independent media and consolidating control of media in friendly hands, friendly oligarchic hands. So that was going on. Then he internationalized all of this. He started to draw international connections between Hungary and other right-wing leaders around the world, by the way, including Vladimir Putin, who Orban became extremely close to, highly problematic from the perspective of European policy towards the Russia-Ukraine war, where Hungary was always an outlier, and drew connections closely to the MAGA wing of the Republican Party. So you had President Trump endorsing, just in an unprecedented way almost, Orban's presidential reelection. By the way, he was just reelected in a landslide 4 years ago. So this is quite a turnabout. You had Marco Rubio showing up in Hungary, and then you had J.D. Vance just last week showing up basically
on the eve of the election,
on the campaign trail, alongside
at a rally,
an elected autocratic leader,
saying explicitly, "Vote for Orban.
Vote for this guy. He's our
our guy." Yeah.
So remarkable in all those ways. And this phrase that I've been reading a lot in the analysis of the election, which I think is originally a phrase that came out of maybe the Soviet Union and Russia, but is broadly applicable now to countries around the world, including other European countries, including here, is that it was an election that was a collision of the television and the refrigerator, is how they describe it. What they mean by that, I think, is the television was dominated by Viktor Orban, the propaganda that he was able to disseminate around the country, tell people what they were supposed to think. But at the end of the day, the refrigerator, people's daily lives, how they eat, how they work, is what actually elections tend to be about. And Magyar dominated when it came to refrigerator issues, even if he didn't have the power of the television.
It's interesting. The parallels you mentioned, obviously the parallel to Epstein, but you've got this aging autocratic-minded leader who's trying to stack the Democratic deck, who's plagued by corruption issues, who's surrounded by a lot of sycophants, who's facing a tough economy where people are really feeling the pinch of affordability. Yeah, the parallels run right down the line. And so it raises some questions. Are there lessons to be learned in the United States for how to counter this movement without trying to overgeneralize, because every context is itself? Now, I will start by saying I have a reader's vocabulary. I didn't realize until you said Magyar, I thought it was Magyar, because I've only been reading
I'm going to confess that I put it into a search engine last night and had a Hungarian voice read it to me over YouTube. So I may or may not be right about that.
I'm going to tell you my favorite and least favorite thing about Magyar before we continue. My favorite thing about him is that his last name, Magyar, literally means Hungarian. So it's like we had a presidential candidate in the United States whose name was Joe American. Like his name is Peter Hungarian. Yep. I mean, that would be pretty good. That's
a good name for politics.
Not bad.
Yep.
My least favorite thing, he was married until 2023 to the justice minister, who actually was sacked as part of this scandal involving the pardon because she had to sign it. They got a divorce. Before they got divorced, he actually secretly recorded her while they were still married, while she talked to him about how she was facing pressure as justice minister from political people in Orban's party to go easy on some prosecutions. And he released this tape publicly. I like a guy who's doing a good job of trying to be an anti-corruption person, but the whole recording your wife and then releasing it publicly.
Spoken like a good guy who may happen to have a wife who's involved in politics, by the way. So I appreciate the moment of candor.
Right. I'm the appointed official with the, exactly. So
by the way, it's worth saying about Magyar, if we are pronouncing that correctly. This is not some radical leftist who has defeated Viktor Orban. As you said, he came out of the Orban movement. He is right-wing on many of the same issues that Orban is right-wing on: immigration, social issues inside Hungary. But in the vein of not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good here, there is actually a lot, I think, to be optimistic about in terms of how he will govern when it comes to Hungary's role in Europe, Hungary's role vis-a-vis Russia, vis-a-vis China, vis-a-vis the Russia-Ukraine war. And, would he be exactly the politician that we would want to lead a key European country? Maybe, maybe not. Is he a massive improvement on what came before? I think it's hard to deny that he is.
And there is this element of next generation trying to build a very broad coalition, a heterodox collection of people with different political views, using new media, because old media, as you were saying, was denied to him. Campaigning in places that you wouldn't ordinarily think he would show up to try to solidify votes, and having a laser focus on two things: one, corruption, and two, pocketbook issues, refrigerator issues. I hadn't heard that phrase before. So there are elements here that could be very much looked at, and potentially with all necessary distinctions.
1,000 caveats. One last thing on him I think is interesting is how he is looking at the issue of accountability. He is not shying away from a lot of clarity that he's going to go after the remnants of the Orban regime. He went on an Orban-controlled TV network that he had been denied access to for years and basically told them, once I take power, he's not yet taken power, I'm going to come and shut you down. So be ready for that. He has basically said that the president of Hungary, you described, this largely symbolic role, doesn't represent the people, should effectively be removed from office. So he is quite clear that he is not going to, quote unquote, turn the page in the way that some politicians say they will do when they come to office.
Now, one thing that we should spend a minute on is this extraordinary trip by J.D. Vance. He shows up there. He puts a bear hug around Orban, probably quite literally.
Have you ever heard of a president, vice president, secretary of state doing this? In
an election for an elected leader of a democracy. It's not something that I've seen before. And of course, it ends up with big egg on J.D. Vance's face. What's interesting to me about it is that this is the literal living out of the national security strategy that we talked about many, many pods ago, where in that document they say we are going to support what they call patriotic parties, literally meaning these far-right parties in Europe, and that we believe this is necessary for America because it's the bulwark against Western civilization. And that's how Orban presented himself. Now, what's been surprising to me is some of the other far-right parties in Europe, like the AfD party in Germany, have actually started distancing themselves from the Trump administration, even before this, because they were recognizing that the bear hug for Trump, even for the voters they're targeting, just doesn't mean what they thought it might have meant a year ago. And it goes to show you how badly the Trump administration's brand has cratered in Europe. And it'll be interesting to see how those parties the far right in France, in Germany, in the UK look at this Hungarian election and say, are we going to have to learn lessons from this? Now, of course, they're out of power. They're not incumbents, so they're in a different circumstance. But something very much for us to look at, not just what are some parallels with the U.S., but what does this mean for the broader landscape and for the Trump-Vance project. Vance did it at Munich. They did it in the national security strategy to try to propagate this far-right movement across all of Europe.
It's backfired in a number of places, and maybe just to link our first segment and our second, a really tough week for J.D. Vance, who showed up in Hungary, campaigned for Viktor Orban, took the L, showed up in Pakistan, spent however many hours, 19, 20, 21 hours negotiating with the Iranians, and came out and gave a press conference and said nothing got accomplished. So tough week. While Marco Rubio, the other potential heir apparent to Donald Trump, I think attended a UFC fight with the president and stayed out of the bad news
right
cycle.
Absolutely. I think the last thing that we have to register, we'll come back to this China question, both in this context and many others, as we head towards what's likely a summit between Xi and Trump in Beijing in a month's time or so. But Ukraine and Russia. Orban explicitly said at various points, Ukraine is not a sovereign country. He was very close to Putin, as you just mentioned.
He actually warned during the campaign about the possibility of Ukraine invading Hungary or going to war with Hungary, which was obviously did not resonate with the Hungarian people, but a strange sort of fear-mongering tactic.
So he had been blocking European funds, very large amount of funds, tens of billions of dollars, going from Europe to Ukraine to help stabilize their economy. Peter Magyar is saying now, those funds will be released. Ukraine will get that money. He's not exactly what I would call the most forward-leaning guy on Ukraine, but he has been clear that he's not going to be pro-Putin. In fact, he said he didn't intend to call Putin. If Putin called him, he'd take the call to tell him to stop the war in Ukraine, and it'd be a short call. So this is a significant thing because it removes one of these major obstacles to the Europeans being able to act together in support of Ukraine. And that is no small thing, especially at a moment when the United States of America is not to be counted when it comes to support for
during
Ukraine.
A week in which, not to dwell everything on J.D. Vance, he came out and said one of the things he was proudest of during the Trump administration is that they had withheld funds.
Yeah, exactly. So another L in a way, because the boomerang on Hungary means that actually Europe will step up to the plate in a greater way. I think this is a good thing. And clearly the Ukrainians are trying to tread carefully, not push the envelope too far. But I do think they feel like they're in a better position. All right. So we'll be back next week. We've got some more good guests lined up, and we're going to actually start taking the opportunity to look at the long game when it comes to issues of industrial strategy, China, the future of the U.S. national security enterprise post-Trump, and many other things with guests in the next couple of weeks.
Escaping the tyranny of the day-to-day. Well, that's all for today. We'll be back next week with a new episode of The Long Game.
Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel so you never miss an episode. And send us your questions and comments at longgame@voxmedia.com. And find us on Substack at staytuned.substack.com. The links are in the show notes.